Woohoo! Hello, everybody, and welcome to, well, as one of my dear fans told me, my weekly show, also known as the ChiroHealthUSA weekly webinar series. And we are so excited to have our first, not a documentation workshop, with Dr. E. Let me just tell y'all, I have really just begun to get to know this incredible woman, but she has an unbelievable story about, y'all know how I'm all about them audits, about her experience going through an audit, and then her passion and enthusiasm and a change in her career where she's trying to educate people so that they can learn from her experience. And man, it is mind blowing.
Unfortunately. Yes.
So, oh, look, hey girl, I miss you. I love it. I love this chat box. I'm going to stop talking, mute myself, but I'm going to let Dr. E take over so she can tell you her amazing story and share with you how you can avoid going down this insane journey that she has gone through over the last couple of years. Dr. E, take it away.
Very good. Thanks. And I'm not going to be keeping an eye on the chat, but Christy and I chatted yesterday. We chatted about a half an hour before the show. This is a brand new PowerPoint slide deck for me. And so it's out of order from the way I'm used to talking about things. And I talked to Christy. I've hosted webinars on my own website. It's medre.com. And I like the presentations to be conversational because I think it's more interesting than just like blah, 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 just going through a bunch of PowerPoint slides. And it also gives Christy a chance to ask questions or comment because she's an expert in her own right about documentation. And also, so I'm inviting you guys, if you have questions at a particular point in the slide, to type it into the chat box and Christy will read it also because I want this to be interactive. We'll have Q&A at the end. Hopefully we'll have time for that. I've got 24 slides, so we'll see. But so I'm ready to say, this is ready to do something different. It's not a documentation workshop. And to get a little bit ahead of myself and dozens of chiropractors were audited in Virginia in 2018. And after that, and learning what I learned, I was posting on my listserv and docs were saying, please tell me, help me going through this also, that I ended up with the mailing list and ended up doing this totally different thing. And here we go. Go to the next slide. So a little bit of history on me. I'm a 1991 Palmer graduate. My first practice was in South Carolina. I sold that office. I bought a backpacker and I wandered in a one-way ticket to Barcelona. I wandered around Europe for 7 months and then ended up in Virginia Beach, Norfolk area, Hampton Roads, where I went to high school, started a second practice here. And my practice of 2001, so 17 years when the audit hit. So it was very established, lots of long-term patients, and we're going to tell you about that audit in a little bit. So 2018 was not when audits began in Virginia, but there were at least 45 chiropractors that our association knew about, and we have just a little over half membership in Virginia. So I would imagine there was probably twice as many as that were audited, and I'm going to talk about the audit process in a little bit. My colleagues, there were a dozen colleagues that I'm close enough that shared with me their financial loss estimates going through an audit, which paralyzes your cash flow for 6 months to a year. 12 of us lost $1 million. And that doesn't count all the other docs who paid recoupments that I don't know that didn't tell me, and people who got stuck in prepayment review. So I never, ever, ever plan to spend my time talking about documentation compliance. Honestly, I would rather be home brewing or making ceramics or adjusting people. I sold my office as direct result of this audit. I hate talking about this topic. It makes me crazy. It's depressing, but I wake up every morning, and if I can help my colleagues prevent going through what I went through because it's avoidable, then I'm going to do whatever it takes. I'm just have become a crazy person talking about compliance and what we can do about it and how we need to change things the way we've done. Now, and lately I've been hanging out in LinkedIn with nefarious characters. And by that, I mean like former investigators for the office, the OIG, Officer of the Inspector General of the federal government that does fraud investigations for Medicare. And they're depressing feeds, but I learn a lot, and I've learned a lot about what they think is fraud and what we might think is like, well, okay, maybe I didn't read my carrier guidelines. So, all right, so now I'm talking about audits, compliant documentations, and what I have, so here's insurance audit. So back to the fraud guys, is we're playing old maid, and the insurance auditors are playing poker. And not just are they playing poker, but they cheat, or they can cheat, and at least some questionable things happen in Virginia. So there's two parts to an audit. I have a post-payment audit is when you have been paid for services a year ago, 2 years ago, you get a letter in the mail and a carrier says, we want to see your documentation from these previously paid services to make sure that they meet our definition of medical necessity and whether or not you documented compliantly. And your bowels evacuate, they give you a list of 10 patients, 15 patients, 30 patients, a 6-month time span, you copy all the pages off, you mail them off in a big fat box, and you don't hear anything for 6 months or so. It took about 6 months for me to hear back from my post-payment audit. And they say, we want to set up a phone call, and here's a letter, and here's the bullet points we want to talk about. And they went to my website, and we had also 7 days a week with massage therapy. And on the weekend, it was more low key and Reiki and hot stone and all of that. And that jerk went through and was like complaining about that being on my website and what I'm billing for. And they're jerks. Prepayment review. Prepayment review, if they determine that your documentation does not meet their standards for compliance, they'll say, you know what? We want to keep our eyes on you, and we're going to be putting you under prepayment review. What that is at a certain date, they will stop paying your electronic claims going through. They want you to send in paper HCFA forms and paper documentation for every single date of service to review to determine if each individual date of service meets their compliance parameters, or they won't pay you. So that's prepayment review. Post-payment audits can cost you big, because if they say, oh, starting 3 years ago, 2 years ago, up until January of 2020, you weren't documenting these services appropriately, you owe us all that money back. So it's time for your bowels to evacuate again. Chances are your malpractice insurance carrier now covers audit legal defense, which is defense. It's not what any settlement might be, what your lawyer ends up negotiating with the insurance carrier, what you ultimately owe and have to pay back, and that's called a recoupment. Prepayment review paralyzes your cash flow, because you're sending out your notes, you're sending out your paper claim forms to some dingy basement in Richmond, Virginia, or wherever, waiting for reviewers to review your notes, and you may or may not find out why your claims were denied without additional footwork on your part, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that. So anyhow, perspective. So these are a few certifications I've got listed at the top here. CMCS is the American Medical Billing Association, so a certified medical coding specialist. CPC, on my list of CPC, is a certified professional coder. CPMA, certified professional medical auditor. CPCO is a certified professional compliance officer. And those are like the American Academy of Professional Coders, and very, this is medical billing and coding and compliance. The guy who is reviewing your notes, the auditor who actually, it's not called the audit department, it's called the fraud and recovery unit. And if you're looking for fraud, you're looking for fraud. You have your glasses on that are looking for things that somebody is doing wrong. And in their book, it's intentional. And even negligence and ignorance, they consider, you know what, you should know better right now. And if you're not doing what you're supposed to be doing, and you know, that's in the introduction or the emailing that went out about having your head in the sand and blinders on and just not paying attention. Not paying attention is no longer an option. And CFE is a certified fraud examiner, or the accredited healthcare fraud investigator. And we got the Association for Certified Fraud Examiners, National Healthcare Anti-Fraud Association. So the guys who are looking at your documentation, that's where they're coming from. It's not like, oh, let's try to help you fix your notes. It's not in their best interest to help you try to fix your notes, because they're looking to recover, find fraud and recover. So this is a picture of my daughter. My audit started in the middle of May of 2018, along with, you know, some docs had been on for a couple of months already, and then other docs were all kind of rolling through. I think they audited too many docs because it ended up being an absolute mess. They stopped paying my claims, and we were getting EOBs back with denial codes 656. I thought I had that written down here. 656, 565, there we go, 252. And all of those denial reason codes in our EOBs. Are you still there, Christy?
I'm here.
Oh, there you are. Okay. So, you know, at any point, once the billing and coding people, if you guys have like an aha, please jump in and say something about that. So you get your EOBs, you're like, please pay my claims. And there's lots of zeros where there should be dollars coming in. And the reason codes basically said needs further documentation. And now we're into June. Now we're 4 weeks, 6 weeks into our audit. All of us, nobody's getting paid. All of them, it says, needs further documentation. And there's no other reason why our claims were being denied. And our association hired an expert to help us out, who was, who was chatting with a bunch of us and said, well, let's wait and see what happens. And in retrospect, I've learned that's absolutely the thing that you're not supposed to do, because when you wait and see what happens, nothing happens. There is no second EOB. From that denial reason, all of us made the assumption that they hadn't read our notes yet. But the fact that an EOB came, it meant they processed the claim form and denied it, which means they had the notes and they denied it for a reason, but they're not giving it to you. And now I know that. So now we're going to June, July, August. In my office, 80% of my office was Anthem Blue Cross Blue Shield. And so you bring cash flow to a screaming halt, and bad things happen for 4 months and you're not getting paid. And I called my auditor. I left a voicemail for my auditor, and I said, you know, Mr. Satan, you better read my documentation, and you either pay me or you give me a reason why my claims were denied, so I can, you know, fix my notes if something's wrong, because I think I've got pretty good notes, or I can appeal it if you guys are wrong. And at first he said, well, I don't have anything to do with that department, the prepay department, because this department that reads audited notes is not the same department that processes other claims. This is the fraud and recovery unit. It's like behind a safe door with a spinning wheel and top secret. And I've made friends with a former, he's a data analyst expert for healthcare who worked for Blue Cross Blue Shield for 9 years. This is how it works. So there truly is a room where they're denying these claims. He said he had nothing to do with that. I just have to do with the prepayment review and the recoupments. And I said, well, somebody needs to tell me what's wrong with my claims. He goes, oh, well, here's the report. And he emails me. This isn't even all of it. I couldn't find a few rows. So this is my daughter with a claims denials report. There are no patient names on there. All it was 15-digit claim numbers, and we had to match them up with EOBs with the names like EOBs this thick, and it took one of my staff people 2 weeks to do that. And in my case, it turns out that those denials, 50% at least of those denials, were errors on Anthem's part, the reviewers. They said that something was missing that wasn't, or something wasn't signed that was. My favorite one was they said, well, the therapist, and they named a therapist by name, did not document the number of reps on this therapeutic exercise code. Well, number one is I didn't bill therapeutic exercise that day. There was nothing we did that had reps involved, and I never employed a person by the name of the person that was listed in my denials report. So my claim wasn't paid for a BS reason that I found out a colleague 150 miles away, it was that therapist works for somebody up near Washington, D.C. So Anthem has, it doesn't matter that I was right. Most of the chiropractors, their claim, when I got my report, I told everyone, get your reports. You have to ask for your auditor. And I said, well, pray tell, what is the name of this report? And how can providers access it? And he said, there is no name to the report, and the only way you can get it is through us, but you don't know about it, and they tell you they don't have anything to do with it. So that's just the scary part of the audit. Most docs, their claims were denied for legitimate reasons, but it shouldn't have taken them 4 to 6 months to find out what those reasons are. And that's part of the sneaky cheating at poker thing that I talked about earlier. They have time on their side and they have money on their side. And even though I was right, I just sort of went down this path. Well, you'll follow that along. All right, so they are right. Medicare, this is from the 2019 Medicare fees for service supplemental improper payment data. So Medicare says that 37% of chiropractors do not document properly. So insufficient documentation is almost 96% as the reason. Some of it's medical necessity. A very small part of it is coding. It's your documentation. Now, I say that I would say that it's higher because Medicare only pays for adjustments. Once you start putting in therapeutic procedures and multiple units of multiple procedures, that makes it even harder for you to substantiate all of that care. So I would very generously say that it's 50%, probably more, of chiropractors have non-compliant documentation. So we are the low-hanging fruit. Insurance carriers know this. And so I have on here, how about HR 3654? So if you haven't been following, there's a bill where we're trying to expand services to therapeutic benefits under Medicare. And I hope that goes through, and they say, well, what's going to happen with chiropractors to participate in that? Well, they have to take another documentation workshop. And it's like, you know what? Most docs have taken documentation workshops. And we're still here 10 years of having the same story of why are so many chiropractors not compliant, and that's what we're going to get to in a little bit. But carriers know this. Fortune 500 list is out. Big four healthcare insurance carriers, United Healthcare, and Cigna, Anthem. They're all in the top 50 U.S. companies ranked by revenue. So fraud and recovery is just one more way for them to make revenue. And when I've talked to malpractice insurance carriers that are defending chiropractors, when I talk to state associations about the compliance thing, they're like, well, don't scare our docs. We had somebody come once and they scared our docs. It's like, you know what? This is as serious as a type 2 odontoid fracture, guys. You should be scared. If you don't know your notes are compliant because you built them that way, they're probably not. And that's why I lose sleep at night. Most docs have tried to fix their documentation. Most have attended 1 or 2 or 3 or more documentation workshops. I've surveyed, like I said, I created a mailing list just from being active on my listserv for docs who were asking for help. And I asked them, they've been, and tell me, if you can relate, but you go to the documentation workshop, they have a lot of material, a lot of PowerPoint slides. You realize there's a lot of things I have to fix. You sit down in front of your computer on Monday morning and you don't know where to start. You're paralyzed. You're like, oh my gosh, I know this is a huge problem. and you end up not doing anything because you got a lot of information, but not much guidance on how to implement that. And often documentation workshops, they're taught by billing and coding specialists because, oh my goodness, that they know this stuff inside and out. There's a chiropractor who teaches documentation workshops, and it's a good workshop, who hasn't practiced in a dozen years. It's different to have been in an office helping transition the office from non-compliant to compliant, because it's not just about what the doc does. All right, so mistake number one is trying to fix everything at once, which is what I just talked about. You sit in front of your computer, you know you're missing functional data, you know you don't have care plans, you know you don't understand medical necessity, and you try to do everything at once, and it's like taking a calculus book and boom in front of you. It's almost impossible to do everything at once. And so we're gonna take you through those steps too. Is the mistake number two is trying to do it by yourself when you have a team at your disposal. That is your staff. Mistake number three, hoping your staff can do it for you. Guys, your staff can't do this for you. So right now, insurance carriers know, if they know half of us have non-compliant notes, they can just throw a net, and they know that half the docs they're gonna snag, either for a recoupment and prepayment review, and look at all the money they're getting back in recoupments, and look at all the money they're not paying us by freezing our cash flow. So let me go. All right, so this will be a long-term project. You need to schedule a staff meeting. You need to start. And the first thing you need to do is review your carrier guidelines as a team. And I have that little grok on there. I'm an old science fiction geek. And Robert Heinlein wrote a book back in the 50s called A Stranger in a Strange Land. And grok is a Martian word for to thoroughly and profoundly understand something. Going to a documentation workshop is not enough to understand what your carriers need, because it varies from carrier to carrier and state to state. They will usually tell you that. And most docs, I have found, have not read their own carrier guidelines. It doesn't hurt that badly. And I would recommend you get together with, you schedule, you print them out on paper. I would recommend killing lots of trees during this process, and I'm a tree hugger. Print them out on paper, review them as a team, because there are elements of all of what has to happen in your guidelines that everyone has to be on board. And Wendy Lee, Christy, you had a guest on here in July who spoke about, from the billing and coding side, and denials, and how to appeal denials, how everyone has to be on board to properly process claims and get things paid and properly handle denials. This is the same thing from the other perspective. This is the doc's documentation, but it's not just the doc doing what they're doing. And I'm going to give an example about care plans as we go. Everybody has to be working at this and understand this, including your patients. So start that with review the carrier guidelines as a team. It will explain what your carrier expects as for documentation to support medical necessity, and what are the documentation parameters. All right, so number two is identify your deficiencies and create an implementation plan. And again, I recommend you do this in a staff meeting format. Break it down, get your highlighters out. Who has something to do with this piece of the puzzle? Is it the doc? Is it the front desk? Is it support staff? Is it an associate? Is it, if you have massage therapists, licensed massage therapists in your office, do they have to do something? For example, in their notes, my therapists were set up as providers in my EHR. They had their own macros that I made, because if you have anybody documenting services in your office and you're letting them write what they want to write and what they should be writing, and your reimbursement or potential recoupment is riding on the fact that it may or may not say what it's supposed to say, I built the macros that my therapists use, so when they use those macros, it said what I needed it to say to support the carrier guidelines. All right, billing other providers, and triage them by level of importance. Once you make your list of what has to be done, what's the most important, do one thing at a time. All right, and so that is carrier's requirements for medically necessary care. Transition away from billing 9894 blank codes for all care to episodic care. And any billing and coding people here on the call, Christy knows this is one of the big problems with chiropractic billing is you can't just bill 9894X for all adjustments without that's indicating that this is an active care plan that you are documenting to the carrier guidelines. If it's a maintenance adjustment, it's not a 989 adjustment. There are other ways, depending on the carrier, to deal with that. So episodic care means if you're familiar with billing Medicare and you've got a care plan and it's this many visits and when you release them, that's how everybody needs to be billing right now. And does not mean you have to sacrifice wellness care as a part of your practice paradigm. You just have to prepare your patients in the beginning. Your front desk needs to know this when they're scheduling people or people are canceling and not rescheduling and it's messing with your care plans and they're getting non-compliant and that's affecting your notes. So that's an example of how everybody needs to be on board for this. So here's an example of the to-do list. So the doc, a care plan. What does the doc have to do? Your notes have to have a care plan, what the frequency is going to be, when you're going to do a re-exam, how long do you think it's going to take, what the anticipated release date is. That's supposed to be in your documentation. The front desk needs to get that. So when you have a patient who's come in for 4 times and they're like, oh, I'm going out of town, it's 2 weeks, and I'll just schedule when I get back, and they fall off. The front desk needs to understand the importance of the patients adhering to the care plan, or at least documenting. For example, most EHR has a feature where you can say the patient canceled for this reason, so that becomes part of the record. Because your care plan's falling apart because a patient doesn't comply, because the front desk doesn't get that piece of the puzzle also because you didn't all share this job together, that's going to be a problem if you get audited, your notes are reviewed, and you don't have care plans, or they make no sense. And Evan William did a care plans that make sense, I think, Christy, a couple of months ago. That should be in your archives. So go ahead.
I said he sure did, and I loved it. There's got to be a beginning and a middle and an end, people.
Yeah. And everyone has to understand that. And when you communicate with the patient, now if you've got, my office was 17 years old. I was pretty good, but we still had patients who had, 20 visits per year under the state plan, the state Department of Human Resource Management. And why can't I come once a month? And why can't it be paid for? Well, because I'm not documenting that as active care and medical necessity per the carrier guidelines and per that particular policy. And so the conversation now has to be everybody in your office supporting that with your patient. And when we transitioned, it was before the audit, because it's due diligence. Guidelines change, or you have a new carrier. You have to respond to that. And when we shifted to, cut and dry, it's like, okay, from this day forth, we will no longer bill 9894X for maintenance care visits because it's wrong and we know it and we have to stop doing that. Then you tell the patient and they're like, well, but why is it new? Why did it change? And it's like, well, you know what, actually, it's always been that way. In the case of this particular plan, it's always been that way, but they are cracking down on enforcing that providers document that way, and this has to stop. And we had what we call a blue letter in the office. And when we did this transition, every patient got one. And then the patient read it and they came back and asked me questions, and they asked me again, and they asked the staff. And so if you're an older office, that's actually one of the risk factors that I'm going to go over at the very end about your odds of having non-compliant documentation. The more patients you've had for a long period of time who may have developed habits that don't support your carrier guidelines and your medically necessary care and your active care, the more it's just, that's why I said this is everybody working towards this happening. And it's hard, and you just have to keep pushing through that. Your associate, I had associates come through. I had a shoulder injury. I ultimately had decompression surgery because, you know, I had that thing and I didn't know, they suck your bursa out when they do the decompression surgery. So it took a couple of years of therapy, but I don't have a bursa over here anymore. So anyway, but while I was going through having a shoulder and not being fully functional, it's almost 30 years I've been a chiropractor now, associates would put stuff in my notes. They would change the macros. And I was like, okay, well, they were in school more recently, and they would just put more stuff in and put more stuff in. And you can't be letting your associates or anybody else, your notes are your reimbursement. And you need to know what's there, why it's there. And if it doesn't need to be there, it does not need to be there. And so that's the associate part. Non-DC staff. Therapists, if you've got therapists doing paper notes, you need to stop that and get them in your EHR, and you build their macros. And I had claims denied because here I had my therapists had their macros, therapeutic necessity was documented, start and time was documented, their services were substantiated, and they were denied because the license number and expiration date for that massage therapist was not in the printed note of that signed note on every single date of service. So did I say, remember that picture of my daughter and the whole long list is 5 months into that audit, it was like, that was my younger daughter. My older daughter, it was either pay the mortgage or pay for her school. Public schools here in Norfolk are not so hot. And so we had to withdraw her from her school a week before her senior year started because I couldn't pay it. And I didn't know how long the audit would go on. And I actually had sent my termination letter to get out of Anthem because it obviously became this shell game with not telling, oh, yes, we denied it for a reason, but you're not allowed to know what the reason is. And we don't have that, there is no name to that, you know. Yes, it was mind-blowingly stupid. And still I wasn't getting paid. And I am 52 card pickup lady, and I can like pivot and turn and run with something. And my older daughter is the cruise ship that takes 2 miles to turn. And it was really hard to go through. We ended up homeschooling, dual enrollment at community college. I graduated her in December because she had enough credits, and we had a whole thing in it. It worked out in a weird way. Horrible thing to go through. I sold my practice in November of 2018. Before getting out of Anthem was complete, it took 120 days. So I had to still see Anthem patients and not get paid because of this stupid game that Anthem was paying. The audit, the fraud and recovery department was paying. And they get away with stuff like that. Billing and coding people on here, please reach out to me. Please talk to your association when your carriers are doing shenanigans, and keep a track record, because when you're under prepayment review audit, you're held to 100% compliance with their documentation requirements 100% of the time. And if it's fair for us, it's fair the other way. We make too many excuses. I heard, Wendy Lee said, oh, they make coding mistakes also. Not good enough. Do you know that our Anthem contract in Virginia from 2015 through currently right now says that when we have our notes reviewed, it's supposed to be by a peer licensed in the state of Virginia? Do you know that asshole lives in Missouri and does not hold a Virginia license? I just discovered this a couple of weeks ago. Why is this okay? It's not. They need to be held accountable. I'm sorry, I'm getting on a high horse. They need to be held accountable instead of, oh, you know how they are. You know what? No, because you know how much slack they're going to cut you when you're being audited? 0. All right, I totally got off my slide there. All right, back to care plans. You release your patient and you're saying, all right, I know you have 20 visits on your plan, under your policy. I know we've only had 14 visits, but you've reached maximum improvement. I can't document your functional improvement any further based upon your carrier's requirements, and we need to put you on maintenance care, and you need to pay for it. You should not be having this conversation the day that you release your patient. This should be part of the conversation from the beginning. You, your staff, everything should be working together to be ready for this moment. So you must know how to manage and how to bill maintenance and wellness care visits in your office with your carrier. And in Virginia, now KMC University, Kathy Mills Chang, she's got a good video in YouTube, and she says she doesn't recommend ever sending in S8990. It's an internal code. Some carriers use it. It is physical or manipulative therapy for maintenance rather than restoration, which is a maintenance visit. Now, in Virginia, Anthem Blue Cross Blue Shield specifically states, this is copied from the Virginia guideline, from their guidelines. There are some self-insured companies that contract with Anthem to manage their claims, and they specifically cover maintenance visits. So a provider should be able to file this and still get paid. Now, I do know a large office in Western Virginia. We just had a conversation a week ago. They haven't been paid for 1.5 years on this code for several employers that they see their patients that cover maintenance care. And I gave them the link to file with the South Carolina Corporation Commission Insurance Division, because that's who handles insurance in Virginia, where to complain to. I said, you need to get them to act on this, because they're just playing, again, they're just dinking around. You know, one more of those, carriers, they make mistakes. No, stop holding them accountable and stop letting them get away with stupid stuff like that. Report every stupid thing that happens. We had Anthem send out a letter in Virginia in 2019 to all state employees that saw chiropractors that said, your provider's no longer in network, which was not true. And a few weeks later, they sent which made everyone freak out and call the office and cancel appointments, and makes us have to explain their mistakes. And we didn't know what was going on. And we had a coding error. I FOIA'd the communication between the SCC when I complained to them and Anthem, and they said, due to a coding error, it was corrected. We sent out another letter. It was 6 weeks later. It's they need to hear every single thing. In most states, insurance carriers are under the Insurance Commission. In Virginia, it happens to be under the SCC Insurance Division. So in this particular case with self-insured companies, you are now violating federal labor law, which is what ERISA is, and more associations and chiropractors in general need to know more about ERISA, because if a carrier, that's the lawsuits that you've been hearing about in New Jersey and Pennsylvania, and they're getting more high profile and they're expanding to other states, those are ERISA violations where carriers are keeping money that's not their money. All right, nowhere to go to complain. Non-covered maintenance care. So ChiroHealthUSA. I would love to say I use ChiroHealthUSA, but I don't have an office anymore. But this is do you want to say a few sentences, Christy, about how you fit into that paradigm about releasing people from active care? And
well, and I threw up in the comment box that just said that when you are discharging your patients from care, that doesn't mean they're going away. It's what helps to establish that shift from active to maintenance care. And I think one of the biggest mistakes that we make, which is why the financial report of findings is so important, letting our patients be aware of what insurance covers and doesn't, because let's all be honest, they have no idea. They're just as surprised as we are when we do an insurance verification. And it never covers as much as they think it should. But at the same time, we don't want to ever devalue the services that are being provided in chiropractic offices. They need to know what the actual cost of care is. And a lot of times we don't talk about it because we don't want to scare people off thinking, oh my gosh, we're going to have to pay $125 a visit for my adjustments and therapies. But that's why you have ChiroHealthUSA for those non-covered services. You can say, hey, look, bottom line is you're no longer covered under active treatment. Your insurance is no longer going to cover it. You've been paying this $50 copay at every visit. The total cost of the services is $125. You can now utilize ChiroHealthUSA in our office for these non-covered services. And instead of paying $125, you're going to pay XYZ, whatever that dollar amount is that you set, because unlike other networks that you're used to working with who dictate what you're going to get paid, we work the complete opposite. You make that decision. What we do is help to make sure that you're still remaining profitable, and we're not, because there's no way to discount your way to success. So we help you to figure that out. Was that good enough?
Yeah, that's good. And also is that you can't have two fee schedules where you're like playing, because then you get in trouble with the insurance commission.
True story. Cash is a 4-letter word, ladies and gentlemen.
Yes. So here you're going to talk about a little bit about cash in a minute. Okay, so function-based treatment plans that support medical necessity. And I've surveyed lots of chiropractors, and functional, where's my card? Your notes have to have some sort of meaningful use of functional data to substantiate care. And that is your electronic health records has to help make that happen. Your outcome assessment tools have to help make that happen. Your front desk needs to know why every 30 days they're having your patient update that tool. Your patients need to understand. We all have patients who are like, oh, this dumb thing again. You either have that little old lady who spends half an hour filling it out, or you have the other person who thinks it's a joke and they just whip through and check whatever else. You substantiating your care, and so that it's reimbursable and not recoupable, relies on that being accurate. What I had my patients do, not my patients, my staff, is when I'm in a busy day, I wouldn't always know that somebody had redone a functional assessment tool. I would have my staff print it out, put it on my desk, so at the end of the day, I was using that information in my documentation to help substantiate their care plan. So grok your guidelines. So on my website, I did a walkthrough with a handful of chiropractors called Grok Your Guidelines. If you go to it's medoctoru.com, on the very homepage, it says click here to get the link to, it's called a snapshot survey. It's a 10-question survey about where most docs are deficient, or to find out where you're deficient. And then the other one is an hour walkthrough with an example staff of a real carrier guideline, and it was the Virginia guideline, just because it's not fun, but it's not as bad as you think. And so it's like, it's the thing that you don't want to do, but you just have to do it. And so that's what Grok Your Guidelines is. And there's a link to that, and it's free. So, but functionally based information is one of the #1 deficiencies in chiropractic documentation that can make you fail an audit. If you've ever heard in a documentation workshop somebody say unsigned notes is the #1 reason for denials, I've heard it from several different specialists and presenters, and technically it's true, but it's not the end of the story, because what happens is docs who sign their notes think, oh, well, I signed my notes, therefore I'm safe. Well, if you don't know that you would hit the save button instead of the sign button, which did happen to some of the docs. It shouldn't have taken them 6 months to find out that that's what, and lose their practice because they didn't get paid for half a year. If you don't realize you should be hitting that signed button within 48 hours, not 2 weeks or 3 weeks later, if it's, see what you have to know what your carrier guidelines say. But if you don't know enough that you should be doing that, you probably don't know enough that you're probably missing 10 or 12 or 15 other things that in your notes. So don't be complacent just because you think I signed my notes on time, therefore I'm safe. There's no way to prevent an audit. An insurance carrier, Medicare, no one knows if you have a travel card. Remember travel card? Oh guys, I love travel cards. So you knew people who only have known electronic records. My travel card might have 9 visits front and back, and I could look and in 40 seconds see their whole arc of care over that time. And I just had it. So that was part of the hard transition to electronic records, is that went away. Let it go, because this doesn't work with that. But they don't know if you have a travel card and you do an adjustment. It's like, okay, here's today's date. I did an adjustment. They don't know if you're just doing a check mark or if you're doing everything you're supposed to. That's why audits happen. So audits are, I'm not saying audits, they're allowed to do audits. Just like if you hire somebody to do your roof, you're assuming they're going to put flashing around the dormer. You're going to assume they're going to put felt paper underneath those shingles. I used to be married to a contractor once upon a time. You're assuming certain things. They're assuming certain things also. They just know that half of us aren't doing that, and so they're collecting dollars. All right, number 6, maximizing EHR capacity, utilization, macros, and templates. So Doc, if you are using, all right, so I have an article coming out in Dynamic Chiropractic in November. It's called The Elephant in the Room, how non-compliant documentation and how we absolutely must fix this. So I'll give you the risk alerts, though, from that article. Is a long-term EHR customer. If you started your EHR with your EHR company 5 years ago, 4 years ago, 7 years ago, and you downloaded macros then, in the beginning, even the big ones were saying, oh, we have libraries where doctors can share with each other, and you can download, this doc has really good notes, and you would download those macros and you put them in your, and that's what you're still using. 90, you're probably non-compliant, because those macros were, number one, it might have been written for a different carrier. It was written by somebody who's not a documentation expert. It may be technique specific that has more to do with what you're doing where than what your guidelines are. So risk alert is the long-time EHR company. Docs who use empty template software. So some of the EHR softwares out there now say, well, we have this empty template and you can put in whatever you need to put in, right? Well, if you haven't read your guidelines and realize the volume of information that has to go in there, chances are you're going to be non-compliant. Docs using shared documentation macro template libraries, talked about that. Most of the EHR companies saying, like, we're fully customizable. You can say exactly what you want to say. Here's me telling you, your notes, your documentation to be compliant is not about what you want to say. It's about what the carrier wants you to tell them. And the sooner you get that through your head and put the steps into place to make that happen, the sooner the day will come when you get an audit letter in the mail and you know you're compliant and you just say, sure, print them off, send them out, and let them move on to the next guy. Because that's what should happen. You should be able to get an audit letter, you know you're compliant, you mail it off, and it's business as usual. All right, and then providers who are focused on technique-specific information. So yes, so for example, in Virginia, the carrier guideline says they want to know what technique you used, and they want to know what segments you used and what listings, but you don't have to go into a whole dissertation about anything specific, technique geekiness about that they don't need to see. If you need to have it there, then you can have it there. But anyhow, roll on. All right, some words about EHR is beware the customization mindset. It's not about what you want to say. It's about what the carrier wants you to tell them. I've heard comments about, well, the documentation appeared templated. In fact, my audit letter, the finding says, well, it appeared templated. It's like, you know what? Shut up. Templates are an effective way to communicate a large quantity of information without dropping anything. Templates are good. The problem with templates is if you salt over too much superfluous information that doesn't have to be there, and that copies over from visit to visit. Remember I talked about that, those associates who kept dropping stuff into my macros? I ended up having a lot of crap in there that didn't need to be there. So when you printed it out, you should be doing self-audits, pull out patients, print out a sequence of visits, you read the notes, and you decide if you would pay you based on what you know about the carrier guidelines. But having a lot of superfluous content that doesn't need to be there hides the good stuff that is there. Because that Benedict Arnold chiropractor who lives in Missouri, he didn't read 1,000 pages of my notes when he also read all of the notes of the other 45 plus chiropractors who got audited at the same time. I went through everything 3 times and I know what was good in there, and you know what, it didn't matter. So that's sort of, I contradicted myself that, you know, but the biggest problem with my notes was there was too much in there that didn't need to be there. And I was having my patients put in their own subjective intake on the iPad at the front of the office. And I'll tell you why that was problematic. You have patients who take 30 minutes, you have patients who take 30 seconds, and they may not recall correctly from one visit to the next, how much better they're really doing. Anything that goes into your notes, you should have control over, because your reimbursement and potential recoupment relies on what that says. So that is one thing that we did transition away from, is I went to doctor input subjective information, even though my system was set up to have the iPad check-in. I hope that made sense. So are there any questions in chat, Christy, or
No, not at all. Mostly just comments, and that they're loving this, and everybody's wanting to make sure they have access to the recording later.
Okay, all right. Okay, so if you have massive changes to make, you may want to go to your EHR training. Now, your EHR might be okay. Don't just say, oh, my EHR sucks. It may be okay, but maybe you're using 5-year-old macros. And that was the case with the largest chiropractic EHR software company that is operating right now, is most of the docs didn't know how to use the new macros. They hadn't gone through the new trainings. And they were leaving themselves at risk. And the software updates, but the macros do not. So docs, use your new macros. If you have something with an empty template and you're not really going to do all that work, then you need to have a software that does have some sort of structure to it. Make sure you complete your trainings and use it. That's a ridiculous reason to fail an audit, because your software can help you be compliant and you're not using it properly because you're paying good money for it and the support and all of that. There's a new app. They call it an EHR. It's an app, and it's a lady's name, and I won't name the name, but they have this big empty template. And I called them and talked to the guy, and I said, well, this is a problem. Well, we have libraries and they can share with each other. And I told him the problem about that. And he said, the software EHR, and he said, but look at the scheduling, and it sends texts, and it has all of these buzzers and bells, which are wonderful. But I said, well, what does EHR stand for? And he said, electronic health record. I said, you know what? That is your number one concern. It's like your billing people can make most things work with most billing systems and the input and all of that. But if the docs notes aren't compliant, all of that is out the window, because you could lose everything. And I know some docs who did. So if this is depressing, go cash. It is possible to have compliant notes. You just don't just throw spaghetti against the wall. I stood in the back of a documentation workshop at our last in-person pre-COVID convention, and hand went up and she goes, well, they would just tell us what they want. And I'm like, they do. It's called your guidelines. Read your guidelines and don't have anything there that doesn't have to be there. And otherwise, because if you have too much there that you're updating that you don't need to be updating, you're just making more work for yourself. So again, back to the survey that I did for chiropractors, I really expected most docs to say, well, screw this. This is a bunch of BS. Most docs actually answered my question about, I will do the work. I am committed to doing the work necessary to fix this. The problem is you just have to draw a line in the sand, set the date. I have an implementation strategy based on the elements that I identified as the most deficient areas for most chiropractors, just if you went through all of this list and you still don't know where to start, I've kind of done that because I helped docs go through this. I called it a boot camp, and I used to wear camouflage and all right, everybody. So anyhow, you don't have to go cash. I talked about this a little bit. Anything that does not have to be in your notes shouldn't be there. It's superfluous content, makes your notes noisy, makes it hard to find the good stuff in there that for you to defend. It has more in there for you to update that you don't have to be messing around with. Chiropractors, if somebody's really bad, one of our tendencies, and I was this way as well, if some people are like, oh, this is cut and dry, oh my God, this guy is a train wreck, I would put more and more orthopedic and neurological testing into their objective finding. Oh, this person is so bad, this is positive, and this is positive, and these are these findings. That's not where they want you spending extra time. They want it in the big picture of the whole plan. So but you can't do that unless you read the carrier guidelines.
We have a quick question. Somebody wants to know where they find their carrier guidelines.
It should be, in Virginia, we use Audited, and you can search there. You should ask your association. I have a link. I don't even see the chat showing up in my window, and I'd hate to close anything if I did, because I have the Virginia, it changed 4 times. I'll tell you what is, I asked my auditor, Satan, I was audited in 2016, November 1st, 2016 to April 30th, 2017. And in spring of 2018, I said, can you please give me the carrier guideline that was in force at the time of my audit? Because guidelines change and CPT codes change. And Satan said, it's the same. And they had changed 4 times. And in that time period, which is just one of the many lies that he told, that I have documented proof about that. So ask your state association people, find it, whatever your portal is for your carrier. But unless you read the carrier guidelines, you are shooting into the fog, because what you're saying is not, you don't know what they're asking for if you haven't read that. So if there's stuff in your notes now that salted over stuff that is like, you know what, this, delete it, because the less that's there, the easier your notes are to make. If you're totally like a shit show, you know what, learn how to use the new macros, download them, and follow your trainings and start from scratch, delete everything. And from that day forth, do them right. And that's yes, it'll be work. Remember what it was like launching in the first place? We had a horrible trainer. Well, we had ChiroTouch in the beginning, and actually that was our second attempt at EHR software. We had another one that we tried that didn't work, and we went back to travel cards, and then we went to, and she was horrible. And it was just, we launched that, and ICD-10 happened 3 months later. It was not a happy year. But it's just, that's what it's going to take. And imagine being able to sleep at night because you know if you got a letter that said, we want to see your notes. And it's like, fine, see them, because you know you're golden. That is, I haven't practiced. I have talked to everyone who will answer my lengthy emails or my LinkedIn connection. I've talked to healthcare attorneys, data analysts, these OIG inspectors, legal counsel for county. I have talked to so many people in my, I would say, beyond sane deep dive into trying to fix this problem for our profession, because we will die if we don't fix this, because we will keep, it's like whack-a-mole. They're just going to keep whacking us because they know they're going to get us. And we just have to stop letting that happen. So, risk. If you want to protest about this being unreasonable for your requirements, for your guidelines, having non-compliant documentation is not an appropriate way to go about it. Fix your notes and work for change in another more constructive way with your state association, with your national association. For example, and I think we only have 3 slides left, we're getting up on an hour, is chiropractic care is considered a physical therapy. And when we have to code and do our pointers, and you're not allowed to do massage or stim to the same area that you do an adjustment, because insurance carriers think that that means you're duplicating a therapeutic benefit to the same area of the spine, and they're bundling us up with other therapies. And I'm sorry, a chiropractic adjustment is not the same therapeutic benefit as massage. And right now, the way the carriers are expecting us to code it and bill it and document it, they're treating it the same way, and that needs to change. And that's, please reach out to me. I'm looking, that's going to be an article coming up with Dynamic Chiropractic in January. And if you have something to say about that, I would love to hear from you. All right, action steps. Ooh, don't. Okay, zombie. That's because it's scary. I hate to scare you, but you should be scared if your office is at risk, because if this happens, very, very bad things can happen. Set a date, review your guidelines, go through my Rock Your Guidelines. If you sign up for, on my site is the mailing list, I'll send it to you. Your staff needs to get on this. Review your EHR training videos, update your macros, your templates, transition away from, I did say maintenance care model. You can do maintenance care, you just can't bill it as active care without documenting for active care. Do proactive self audits, and I know you probably, Christy, you had, how many experts here have said do self audits. I have webinars and a blog with more stuff about how to do addendums properly with other experts and all that kind of stuff. So prepayment review, 100% accuracy, 100% of the time. We need to hold them to the same standard. Keep everything. If you communicate with a provider, if you communicate with a carrier in the portal of the carrier, that goes away after 30 to 60 days. You save it as a PDF on your computer, which is saving my butt. I am trying to get some legal stuff happening against what happened to a bunch of us going in Virginia. And if you don't have the documentation and all of these communications, then you don't have anything to fight with. You don't hear docs talking about their audit because either they're embarrassed, or if they paid into recoupments require a settlement contract, and the settlement contract says you're not allowed to talk about the settlement. So they have both ends of that. Read your contract, it's long. Sit down with some coffee and do that. Important, having access. How much longer can I go, Christy? We're 2 minutes over.
You keep going.
Okay. Data. And in Virginia, we started with trying to get an IPN going and using Infinity as a claims processing, but it's more than just claims processing. It's data analysis that we have control over as providers. And initially when we did that, they asked docs to chip in $2,000 to help get this going. And I was one of them, and a bunch of us did. And so I started using them as a clearinghouse. And what ended up happening is now that I'm trying to get this complaint going is when Anthem says I was an outlier, Infinity has my data and they can say, no, she wasn't. If you've gotten claims analysis letters, and that's happened in Virginia recently, that says you're an outlier, please call the provider education department and tell us why you're doing what you're doing. It's like, number one is, if they're saying you're an outlier, based on their data is private and they don't want you to see it. So number one is like, you should ask them for that data, and they probably won't give it to you to set the benchmarks. But if you belong to something like Infinity, and I believe Infinity, Brad Cost is the president, he's been on here also. Everyone, you need to use a clearinghouse that is an analysis center that will work for you if you get stuck in something like this, or you get a letter saying you're an outlier, because Infinity's been able to share with us that when carriers have accused providers of being outliers, we were able to prove they weren't. So there's their email address. Remember that audit departments are fraud and recovery. They're expecting to find fraud. They're looking for deficiencies that in their mindset is fraud, and they're looking to recover. Transition away from your active billing codes and bill properly. Be a member of your state association. Act on every single thing. Escalate when you need to, because we can't play old maid anymore. They're playing poker. they can cheat, and I'm working on that also. So there you go. So if you're in a state that was subjected to audit like Virginia was, please reach out to me, because I am actively exploring some curious things that I got some recoupments, what was happening with docs who paid money back, not just chiropractors, because this is not just a chiropractic problem. Don't think that we're the only ones who suck. Christy knows this too. So
I do. And it's so funny because often, and we talked about this yesterday, I hear all the time that we're always being picked on. It's chiropractors who are always getting picked on. But honestly, I have friends who are dentists that feel the same way. I have friends who are MDs, small family practice. They swear they're getting picked on too. It's all of healthcare. It's all of healthcare. Nobody's special. We're all out there on the plate. We're being, we've got to start doing things right.
And I think there needs to be a change with how things are done, and we can work for that. And in the meantime, stop being a target.
Absolutely. And I did include the link to the Infinity's website, because the work that Brad Cost and Dr. Jake Greenstone are doing right now is just absolutely incredible. The last time they were on here on the webinar, we were talking about different statistical data that they were gathering, but the amount of data and what they can do and how it has helped chiropractors all over the country is mind-blowing.
Yeah.
It blows my mind that people will use a clearinghouse that's actually, it's a free clearinghouse from Blue Cross Blue Shield.
Which keeps their data private. And then it's like this, twisting the mustache. So I just want to, just for an example real quick. So talking about targets, is docs who just do adjustments, you're probably not going to get picked on because there's no money to be really found there. But so if you're doing therapeutic procedures, multiple procedures, or multiple units, or both. So you would think that they would care that we would get people better faster. They don't care if we get people better faster. So if you're doing therapeutic procedures, chances are you're doing it because it supplements what you do. And I would say it helps having intersegmental traction, having a massage therapist do targeted work. It helped my people get better faster. But insurance carriers pay more money. So if somebody goes to get an adjustment, and just say they have a $35 copay, the contracted rate is $40. So Anthem's paying you, or whoever, the carrier is paying $5. 30 visits cost them $150. That's chicken feed. If I got somebody better in 12 visits, that's good, right? No, because I'm billing therapeutic procedures to help them improve faster and get there quicker. So now you have a $35 copay, but your number of units in your procedures just went up to $110. 12 visits cost them $900. They're going to go after the person who they're paying the most money to. So anyway, that popped into my head.
Well, I love, so Dr. E has been following the webinar series, and obviously she's watched several of them because she referenced a lot of them. So just know that if you want to go back and look at some of the webinars, several of you asked about the recordings. Everyone who registers gets a link to the recording. But if you're looking for specific topics, you can search them by speakers. You can go chronologically. Dr. E will be listed at the top of the page tomorrow. You can search by topic if you want to learn specifically about audits or coding or documentation. You can search by topic, and it'll show you every webinar that we've ever covered under that. So just check that out. You don't have to email me to get access to those webinars. You don't have to email me to get access to the recordings. They live on forever. The only time we ever replace one is because it's been updated by the speaker over time, or it is no longer relevant because there have been policy and procedure changes on the state and federal level. We want to make sure you have the most up-to-date information at your fingertips at all times. You do not have to be a ChiroHealthUSA provider to have access to this information. We believe that knowledge and education is free at all times. And so we make sure that all of this is open to you without having to have a login or a password or give me your email address, except when you're registering for the webinar itself. So check it out. Make good use of all of that information. Again, if you are on here right now, you will get a link to this recording in about an hour, hour and a half, so that you can watch it again and again and again, because Dr. E is just like me and we talk a million miles an hour. That is Yankee blood for my New York daddy. even though they raised me in the South. So next week, we're going to be talking about hidden risk in your practice with my friend, Dr. Amy Wood. So I'm super stoked about that. We got a lot of stuff coming up. I also posted in here when we were talking about EHR. So it's not posted on the website yet, slackers. But I have somebody working on a webinar because we've been talking a lot about hidden risk with EHR. Like, how do you know if your EHR is compliant? How do you know? Well, there are some things that you need to know as to whether or not your EHR is compliant, and that's coming up in a webinar in November. We got Kathy Mills Chang, who we talked about today. We have Holly from California and Dr. Miles Bodson. Y'all, she just celebrated her 20 years. You don't believe that beautiful woman is 45. Anyway, I love her and I miss her so much. And then we have Dr. Stephen Krause, who's going to be talking about providing impairment ratings in 15 minutes using X-ray software, but not an X-ray machine. So much good stuff. And for those of you who think you might want to retire someday, I don't mean like today or tomorrow or next year even, but it's something that you definitely have to think about into the future. We have Dr. Tom Nasila coming on here. I bring him on 2 to 3 times a year because I feel like it's just never too early to plan for those long, lazy days of retirement. Or you could be like Dr. E and you could just totally get back to the profession and totally talk the talk, walk the walk, get excited and passionate. I think that's probably, I told her this earlier, it's what it drew me to her. It's her passion and enthusiasm. This was not her plan. This was not her plan for her career. Yeah. But man, look at what she's doing. So you will see her back again in 2021. So we've gone over our time. So I will say to you, have an amazing rest of your week. Get some rest this weekend because you deserve it. And I will see you all at the same time, same place next week. Bye, y'all.